Hello and welcome to the December 4th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway. So I am now finally back in Ukraine after my little adventure in the United States, and the very first 2 nights that I came back to Ukraine, there were drone attacks on both occasions. So allowing me to come back home, immediately hear the soothing sounds of anti-aircraft fire. So, welcome back. And now also the power outage schedules. Yes, after a couple of months of having uninterrupted electricity, we are now back to power outage schedules. This time, not as bad as some of the previous ones, at least not yet. We're only looking at about 4 hours without electricity a day. Well, a couple days ago, it was significantly more than that. There was one day where I only had 2 hours of electricity, but right now, it's going not as bad. We'll see how that continues. Ukraine is currently prioritizing trying to ask for anti-aircraft systems of one means or another in order to shoot down the rockets that destroy our electricity infrastructure to prevent further degradation to the electricity infrastructure. So hopefully, Ukraine gets more systems to protect our electricity, because it's looking like it will be a bit of a cold winter. It's already pretty frosty out there, even at the very end of November and into December. Really hoping that heat stays on. But before we get into real news, I think there's one topic that has been frustratingly prominent within the last week that I suppose we should go over, because it has to do with the realm of podcasting. And so we have to talk about Joe Rogan. In an episode where Joe Rogan was, I don't feel like looking up who he was talking to in that episode, because this is already causing more trouble than it's worth. But talking to a guest, Joe was talking about how the United States was giving permission to Ukraine to use long-range missiles against Russia, and we'll get more into some actual news on that a bit later. But as he was commenting on that, and he said, Zelensky says Putin is terrified. Fuck you, man. You fucking people are about to start World War III. And as you could imagine, a lot of Ukrainians were quite offended by Joe Rogan telling them to go fuck themselves, which led to a large outburst from not only Ukrainian social media, but Ukrainian political figures as well. You had first Vladimir Klitschko, the boxer and the brother of the current mayor of Kiev. If you are a boxing fan or are German, Germans love the Klitschkos. You would know of Vladimir Klitschko, the former heavyweight boxing champion, and the kind of guy who you think that Joe Rogan would respond to. He's very much in the world of fight sports, and Vladimir Klitschko is a very big name in the world of fight sports. So Vladimir Klitschko offered to have a conversation with him about the Ukrainian people. And in addition to Vladimir Klitschko, there was also Dmytro Kuleba. Kuleba is the former foreign minister of Ukraine and a very talented communicator. I think one of the best talents that Ukraine has right now. He should be given another job doing something important, saying that he would go on the show as well to explain to Rogan's audience not to have the opinions that Joe expressed earlier. Now, I used to listen to the Joe Rogan Experience pretty regularly, once upon a time, before COVID completely broke him as a person. And if you were to tell me 10 years ago that Joe Rogan would somehow become a political kingmaker, I would have thought you were an idiot. Joe Rogan is a stand-up comedian of middling talent who has had a few roles playing himself, such as on news radio. Some of you may know him as the Fear Factor guy or as the color commentator for UFC. And once upon a time, he was kind of the idiot, but still likable conspiracy theorist stoner. And I think a lot of his public perception is still from that time, where basically whoever he would have a conversation with, and these conversations on his podcast would range for 4 hours even. It's a very, very, very long form, very unstructured kind of thing, where he could talk with famous media figures, athletes more than anything, fighters more than anybody else. Fighters and comedians are his bread and butter, but also popular science figures, that kind of thing. And his MO was always that whoever he was talking to, he would basically just be fascinated by and reflect whatever their opinion was. Though there is often the case of whoever he was speaking to trying to impress Joe for whatever reason by getting him to talk about his own favorite topics. And That's ultimately a harmless thing to listen to. However, like with a lot of people, COVID kind of changed his brain around. He got deeply enmeshed into the kind of COVID denialism sphere, which all flowed into Trumpism, MAGA, that kind of thing. Which is one element that I don't think that the media has really picked up on, is that there used to be a wide variety of weirdo conspiracy theorists, some of them more harmful, some of them more harmless. But Joe is always in that sphere. He's best friends with Alex Jones, for example. Pretty deep into that. These guys who are basically dirtbags, but that wasn't necessarily that much of a bad thing once upon a time. However, that has all been funneled into this kind of event horizon of idiot brainworms, where once upon a time someone could believe that the moon landing was fake, but still be overall okay to hang around with. Now they are all far-right psychopaths. And that's kind of where Joe went and why I stopped listening to him. It became less fun to have him just go all into the world of the conspiracy theories, but not the fun ones, the scary ones. So all this talk of Joe can talk to anyone and have a great conversation. He's just there to talk to people of all different backgrounds. You could have made an argument for that 5 years ago. You absolutely cannot anymore. His brain has been completely cooked by these far-right conspiracy theories. He is in that world. He's not going to change his mind. He is locked in. There's a lot of talk about how Kamala Harris had to go onto his podcast, and being passing on that opportunity was what sank her in the election or something. No, that's not who the Joe Rogan voter is. It could have been years ago, but it certainly is not anymore. Do not think that we can educate him or change his mind, turn him to the good side. That's not where he's at anymore, and we need to face that reality, not just in the world of Joe Rogan, but more broadly. He is emblematic. He did not necessarily lead in this. A lot of people have been trying to frame it as, oh, Joe Rogan is purposely trying to lead people to the far right. Kind of the opposite. His audience is what led him there. He is the ultimate case of audience capture and also just flattery. When you're the kind of person who just is completely open, he was flattered a lot by a lot of despicable people. And that's kind of where he got steered to. A lot of it's an ego thing. He did not, again, lead this transition into the world of hardcore pro-Russian brain sludge. He was led there along with his audience, following the same trends. Did some people pick up on those trends because of him? Yes, but it still has to be seen as a kind of parallel development. And where they have led to, there's no rescuing them, I don't believe. So yeah, a couple of years ago, might Joe Rogan been convinced that the Ukrainian people deserve to live? Yeah, not anymore. And that kind of opens it to this broader conversation about podcasts and media and alternative media versus mainstream media. I don't quite feel like getting bogged down into that right now, because I tried to draft out some of my thoughts of where that could go, and it led me basically nowhere. Maybe I'll bookmark that for later, but what we are facing is a problem of information siloing. And some of these silos are just completely broken. But part of the reason why they are completely broken is people sought them out to be completely broken. People did not talk about Joe Rogan being this huge political figure that everyone needed to talk to when he was more of just the kind of dumb autodidact kind of guy. He's being talked that way now that he's already locked into this far-right MAGA pro-Russian kind of setting. That is what's making him politically relevant now. People are confusing the order of operations there. And I have no idea how to get away from that information siloing. Like, let's look at this podcast. If you listen to this podcast, I assume that you're also consuming other Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian kinds of media. I highly doubt that we're your first and only source of information about Ukraine, as much as I may like to flatter myself on that. You yourself are in a bit of a silo right now. That could be a good silo. Honestly, I'm not opposed to that. I think people should have good media hygiene. And I think that if you're going to only listen to worthwhile sources, that's going to put you into a pretty narrow media silo. Personally, I try to not be so stuck into one thing, but that means purposely listening to a bunch of horrific nonsense that kind of degrades at your own mind. I wouldn't recommend that to everyone. And we've all seen it. Can people's minds really be changed by giving access to new good sources? It can be, but it takes prolonged effort that someone decides themselves that this is the kind of thing that they want to look into. They're not just going to see a clip one day of someone speaking intelligently about Ukraine and that will flip some switch in them and make them a decent person again after cheering for Ukraine's annihilation. I don't think it really works that way. You look for the media that affirms your own beliefs, unfortunately. And I think this faux commitment to neutrality that a lot of media sources try to take, I don't think that's helping to solve this problem, because then you have an issue of someone who just says they're neutral when they're really not, such as Joe Rogan, and that's only there in order to give cover to their own extreme beliefs. The most insane things you'll hear will come from people who are saying they are being neutral. And then the other category here are the news outlets that are so dedicated to sounding neutral that they will purposely twist the truth to kind of give one side a honesty handicap, which we see a lot with Ukraine and Russia, where I saw it's not as much of a problem now, but especially near the beginning of the full-scale invasion, you saw a lot of very legitimate news sites trying to dig into what the Russians were claiming and act like they had some validity when it did not at all whatsoever. They were lying, but to be neutral, you had to give equal weight to lies and the truth. And that's not good either. So yeah, solution to any of this, no idea. Keep listening to Ukraine Without Hype. We're good. I don't know. Like I said, it takes prolonged contact, and it's a lot of, on an individual level, someone has to make the choice to seek out good information. And nobody is listening to Joe Rogan because they made that choice. Anyway, time for real news. Joe Rogan was in the discussion all throughout. Ukraine media with important politicians reflecting on him. I don't know. I'll figure out better thoughts later. This is all just rambling. Moving on to real news. Battlefield updates. And right now, Ukraine is in its most fierce fighting and some of its most hazardous fighting of the entirety of the full-scale invasion. And we've been talking about this for the last few months since the fall of Avdiivka, starting out with the south of Donetsk region. That's still going very poorly. I don't know how to say that in a better way here. The situation on the front line in the southern Donetsk region is going extremely poorly. The front line keeps falling back with every passing day, with new cauldrons and such having to be abandoned time and time again. The Russians absolutely have the initiative, and Ukraine has not yet been able to build proper fortifications to stop it. Looking directly at Pokrovsk, the Russians have not been able to advance directly any further to it. I feel I don't need to explain for the millionth time the importance of Pokrovsk, but that is the pivotal location in these battles right now. However, the Russians have been able to bypass further west of Pokrovsk in an attempt to attack it directly from the south, or God forbid, further up the road to the east, where there may be more vulnerabilities and fewer prepared defenses. So that's what they're trying right now in the Pokrovsk direction specifically. If you look a little bit south of there, the front line is, we really have to pay the most attention to Velika Novosilka, is one of these larger towns to the south of there. And if that town falls, there is not much left between it and the border between the Zaporizhia region and the Donetsk region. The Russians very much want to capture the entirety of Donetsk region. It has been tier 1 of their war goals, is to capture the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk. They control almost the entirety of the Luhansk region with some exceptions, and the capture of Velika Novosilka would bring them much closer to their goal of taking the Donetsk region. Between it and the border with Zaporizhia region, there, and Dnipropetrovsk region for that matter, there's really just a bunch of smaller kind of agricultural towns, while it is a bit more substantial in size, though still quite small, don't get me wrong. However, as always, there is a river there, which the Russians have not always been good at crossing rivers. This one in particular is the Mokryali River. Well, river can be a bit of an exaggeration. It's not that large, but it will form a natural border if the Russians can take Veliki Novosilka, which they are very much on the doors of. However, the other worry is that as these lines are pushing further west in the Donetsk region, it will make supply to the areas still under Ukrainian control that much more difficult. The highway that services the southern Donetsk region is extremely under threat. The other front we very much have to pay attention to is Kupiansk. Last episode, when we were talking about the news, I mentioned that the Russians had hit the Oskol River, and they are currently in the process of consolidating those advances in order to cut off Kupiansk from the south. If we look to the north of Kupiansk, the village of Synkivka has been the defensive front line protecting Kupiansk since basically the Kharkiv counteroffensive, when that whole territory was recaptured by Ukraine from the Russians. And that front line had been pretty static ever since then, again with Synkivka being the gate. Well, the Russians were able to breach that gate. It is still a small breach, but a small one here is a big change when it has been static for so long. To the immediate east of Synkivka, in between Synkivka and the Oskol River, the Russians were able to breach those defenses and have placed themselves on the immediate outskirts of Kupiansk from the north. Meanwhile, the Russians have done a crossing of the Oskol River, which was one of my big fears. The Oskol is a very important defensive line, and the Russians were able to cross it at one point. It's not a very deep penetration of the Ukrainian lines there. Russians have not gone too far to the western bank of the Oskil, but still, they're there, which means they have a beachhead, which can be used for more destructive reasons later. So the towns of Kupiansk and Zelskilia lie on either bank of the Oskil, Zelskilia on the eastern side, Kupiansk on the western side. The geographic reality of the Oskil River there says that will be a very difficult battle. However, I do think that is the one we're going to look to next. Even, I think, before Pokrovsk, I think Kupiansk will be the site of the next big battle, and those villages need to be evacuated now. We need aid to get those people out now, get them to the other side of the Oskil, get them deeper into Kharkiv Oblast, Kharkiv City, something. But this is a pocket that is trapped on the opposite side of the Oskil River with minimal ways to actually cross it, which is an advantage for the defenders, but also creates a funnel for anyone trying to get out. So yeah, paying very close attention to the Kupiansk front. So that's the situation on the front. Moving on to the most perhaps frustrating media cycle in a lot of frustrating media cycles, which is the so-called escalation that the Russians have used to threaten nuclear war. So here's the order of events, but treat these as chronological order and not necessarily causality. So putting that disclaimer in right at the start, one step did not cause the next step. I'm just presenting them in the order that they happened. So I think the first one to talk about here is the introduction of North Korean troops to the war, something that spooked a lot of governments. And because it spooked the US so much that North Korea is now fighting for the Russians, that America finally gave permission to use long-range missiles, in this case in particular the ATACMS missile, the ATACMS system, in order to counter the North Koreans. And so the initial usage of long-range missiles were mostly targeting various infrastructure used by the North Koreans in the Kursk Oblast and then also the Bryansk Oblast. There is some reporting at first that this would be unrestricted use. That was then followed up by what sounded like the United States was saying it could only be used against Russians in the Kursk Oblast, but then we also saw them used in the Bryansk Oblast. So we don't actually know the conditions that America placed on the use of long-range weapons. Those conditions exist, but it's for the best that people don't actually know what they are. Ideally, there wouldn't be any, but this is the next best option. And after this was done, again, after only in the chronological sense, Russia decided to show off the use of its Oreshnik missile. This is a missile that is intended for use with nuclear warheads. However, in this case, it did not use a nuclear warhead. It seemed to use a dummy warhead. This Oreshnik missile is a variant of the RS-26 Rubezh missile. There's not too many changes between this older version and the newer version. This being talked about like some brand new super weapon that nobody has seen before, but it is mostly just an updated version of an older missile that everyone already knew about. And the Russians used this Oreshnik missile to fire at the Pivdamash complex in the city of Dnipro. This is a very legendary and storied industrial complex in Dnipro. We've mentioned this a bit in the past, but Dnipro was the main site for constructing rockets in the Soviet Union. For a while, it was a closed industrial city, and its importance as the rocket city also meant that it gave the city of Dnipro a lot of political power within the Soviet Union. The Dnipro clan gave us both a Premier Brezhnev in Soviet times and Timoshenko in modern Ukrainian times. And this complex was the site that they were made. So it was a very symbolic strike because, again, this missile wasn't loaded up with enough to cause so much damage, per se. But it was a symbolic strike against Ukrainian missile infrastructure, I guess you can call it. Apparently, the Russians had informed the Americans beforehand that they were going to do this, which makes sense, that because this is, again, a missile meant for nuclear warfare, and so if the Russians were firing off a nuclear missile without anyone else knowing about it, it would immediately trigger nuclear Armageddon, mutually assured destruction. Everyone would have launched their nukes at Russia as well. So they had to inform the Americans that no, this is not a nuclear attack, therefore you do not have to nuke us in return. And that's a very important point here, because it means the Russians are very much still thinking in terms of mutually assured destruction, because it puts everything else that they're about to do in context. Because this was seen as a way of them threatening nuclear war, and they wanted everyone else to think of this, at least publicly, as the Russians threatening nuclear war. They said that any government that was supplying long-range weaponry to Ukraine in order to attack Russia was leaving themselves open to attack by Russia by nuclear weapons. Now, the last episode before I went off to America, so only like 3 episodes back, you'll find our nuclear episode where we talked about how all of Russia's nuclear threats are stupid and meaningless. They have made so very many of them, only for those nuclear threats to be immediately forgotten. And another reminder, when Russia says that people cannot attack Russian soil, in their own constitution, that also means the occupied parts of Ukraine. American, European weapons have already been used against Crimea, against Zaporizhia region, Kherson region, Donetsk region, Luhansk region, and according to the Russians, that's all Russia as well. Therefore, there is no difference, according to their own nuclear deterrence theory, in between an American long-range missile being used against Crimea and against Kursk. So, once again, anything where they are threatening to treat those 2 cities, Sevastopol and Kursk, any differently, is them already admitting that occupied Ukraine is not Russia, and they're lying. So that's always interesting. But also, because they were already informing the Americans in order to avoid mutually assured destruction, that's a reminder that they still are aware of mutually assured destruction. Nuclear war is not avoided because of some political red lines and we want this and that. It's avoided because once one person uses nukes for any reason, they're getting nuked. And Russia doesn't want to be nuked. And of course, with the follow-up idea that all the places they nuke have a lot of Russians in them, including the Russians that matter. Putin's children are in Paris. Everyone else's children, London, Paris, Rome, New York, they moved their families out of Russia to keep them safe. They moved their money out of Russia to keep it safe. They're not going to nuke their own families for themselves to be nuked in return. That's stupid. And though the Russians do stupid things all the time, the ruling elite are also very selfish. And we can rely on their selfishness, at least. They have easier ways of killing themselves. And what do you know? Here we are recording this episode, 2 weeks after this all occurred? You barely hear it anymore. Of course, with the exception of Rogan, but that's already coming in late and already a long news cycle away from even that. All these threats of nuclear war vanish with the news cycle, and we'll never hear of it again except for people constantly talking about the Russians threatened to do World War III, as the reason for that fades away in their memory, leaving only the idea of Russia threatening World War III. It just becomes a vague platitude with no thought or reason behind it until the next time that Russia does one of these nuclear bluffs. And we do this all over again, and we'll explain it on the podcast all over again, rinse and repeat, until the actual nuclear war that wipes out humanity in 200 years. But yes, more details on that is on our discussion about it 3 or 4 episodes ago, so just scroll a tiny bit down in your feed. Next, we have some diplomatic news, and this is where it's getting interesting. The context for all this, of course, will be that the United States has already released what Donald Trump's plan for peace in Ukraine will be, which more or less translates to freeze the front line, allow Russia to hold on to its current gains while providing Ukraine with some kind of security guarantees for the future. And if Ukraine rejects this idea, then to cut off all U.S. aid in order to force Zelensky and the Ukrainian government to the table. And conversely, if Russia doesn't come to the table, to provide Ukraine with more aid. The person whose name is kind of attached to this, although I want to give him full credit, but he's the one who's getting the most credit for it, is General Keith Kellogg, a retired lieutenant general, who is now going to be Trump's official envoy on Ukraine and Russia. Now, what I described makes it sound like Kellogg is not very friendly to Ukraine, and that's because that's my read on it. I think proposing this solution of strong-arming Ukraine to the diplomatic table with threat of withdrawing all aid is not a very pro-Ukraine move to make. However, he also has a bit of a background as being more of a Ukraine hawk and calling for the end of restrictions on Ukraine, such as with the long-range weapons, and providing more aid to help Ukrainians get the job done. He has said that in the past as well. I think that he, along with a lot of other Republicans, had this natural inclination to protect Ukraine in the Cold Warrior sense of things, but he, like everyone else, have snapped into place of Trumpism and have to present this idea in ways that are friendly to Trump, with the idea in mind that Trump has the ultimate yes or no and could crush them in their career with so much as a rude nickname. The entirety of the Republican Party exists to the pleasure of Trump, and Keith Kellogg I'm not going to treat as any different. If Trump tells him to abandon Ukraine to the wolves, he will gladly do so. Don't trust any of these people. That said, officially, a part of this plan is that if Ukraine is willing to come to the table with it, then they can continue to receive aid as that happens. And if Russia says no, then Ukraine will get more aid. That's the flip side of threatening Ukraine with having their aid cut off. So I think what the Ukrainian political sphere is counting on here is that if they look like they're the ones playing ball with Trump's plan, then they can kind of avert the evil decree here. If they're the ones who are gassing up Trump, if they're the ones who look cooperative and are filling the role as Trump envisions, then there can be more aid or something, or at least to avoid the worst possible outcome. Well, of course, if Russia doesn't do so, then they're the problem. And what do you know? This plan has already been presented to the Russians, and they've already said no. So if we are taking this plan at face value, and I don't think you should, but if we do, then that means that Ukraine should get more aid and Russia is fixed in as the bad guys. So I think that is what the Ukrainian government is doing here, because now Zelensky came out and said that if Ukraine receives, his phrasing was protections of under the NATO umbrella. He did not specifically say NATO membership, but under the NATO umbrella, and other members of the Ukrainian political sphere have then followed up by saying, we mean NATO membership, but they left that to interpretation. Then it could be possible to have a ceasefire along current lines while hoping to regain the occupied territory in the future through diplomatic means. In the future, they have not been so sly of saying when Putin dies. If Putin dies and Russia is thrown into political chaos, then at that time, Ukraine can move to recover the occupied territories. So that's now out in the air. These plans are on the table, as it were. Rhetorically, as I said, this should mean that aid should continue under a Trump presidency, because according to Trump's own criteria, Russia rejected this plan, and therefore Ukraine should receive ever more aid and an easing of restrictions on how to use that aid. I just don't think that Trump is locked into his own words. He could change his mind tomorrow. He can interpret this entirely differently. We can't rules lawyer our way around what Trump wants. That's not how he thinks. And this is extremely dangerous territory, but it is the territory we are forced to walk into because Trump will be president. And we'll close off with our international section. And oh boy, is the world on fire right now. We'll look specifically at 3 countries, Romania, Georgia, and Syria. As I began recording, there was a coup in South Korea that has already been concluded. That was crazy, but we're not going to talk about that. We'll start with Romania. In Romania, they recently had the first round of the presidential elections, with the second round coming up this weekend. And the person who came in first place in that first round of elections, describing to our Americans here once again, when we talk about first round and second round of elections, how a lot of countries that have a multi-party system do it when you're voting for just the one person, is that in the first round of elections, you'll have all of your candidates together on the ballot, and whoever comes in first and second place without receiving a majority, if someone receives 50% of the electorate plus one, they will then just win the election outright. However, that is often not the case in a multi-party system. So when you have a bunch of candidates, you take the 2 who get the most votes out of that list, and then they will be the second round. And in Romania, the first place was Georgian, and the second, Elena Lesconi. Elena Lesconi, I'll start by soft walking into this, is from a smaller political party in Romania. That's kind of what's interesting here, is that the main political parties, their candidates, did not make it to the second round, but she is kind of a pretty typical Central East European liberal candidate. You know, a little bit towards the center right, you could say. But, pro-Ukraine, pro-Europe, that kind of candidate, not far from what we now see in the governments of Moldova or Poland. The first place, however, is an absolute psychopath. Georgian is a Nazi. When I say Nazi, I mean this in the sense that his political heroes are the Iron Guard in Romania. The Iron Guard, well, Romania in World War II was an Axis power. Their government was a fascist one that actively took part in the Holocaust. The Iron Guard were the people who thought that they were too soft and not fascist enough, leading to them trying to take power in 1941 and losing. So Cordrenu, the guy who thought the fascists were not fascist enough and needed to be more Hitlery, that is who Georgian idolizes the most. Though, interestingly enough, this election apparently has little to do with minority nationality politics. Plenty of Romani, I guess, will be voting for him. Romanian politics does not make much sense to me, but here we are. The more important thing, other than all of his wackiness, such as thinking that water is not made up of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, but rather is some magical substance, and by moving to the Romanian countryside and bathing in Romanian spring water, you can ward off all diseases. Kind of a RFK Jr. kind of figure in that way, in that all conspiracy theorists are now the same, which kind of ties back to my Joe Rogan segment, in that all conspiracy theorists are now the same. They're not just harmless kooks anymore. They're all psychotic fascists. COVID stuff, of course, always COVID stuff. But the important thing here is that he's very pro-Russia, to the point where it is very likely that Russia is who won this election for him. Georgian is an independent candidate. He does not have the backing of any political party. And up until a few weeks ago, apparently no one's even heard of him. It wasn't until close to the end of the election cycle where there was a massive amount of social media boosting of him and his message, primarily on TikTok. And it seems that a lot of this, especially TikTok boosting, was done by a series of bot farms. And at least one of these bot farms can already confirmed as being a Russian influence operation. So people went from seeing him basically never to every Romanian, when they scroll through TikTok or whatever the case may be, having his speeches come up, or speeches and something about him come up. You don't really get a full speech on TikTok, except for that time that Hitler went viral recently there. Now, the Supreme Court in Romania did deliberate on whether this might have invalidated the first round of the election or not, that it was basically completely manipulated by Russian bot farms. And of course, he is tied in with Dugin as well. Dugin was promoting this guy, a Russian fascist Dugin. And the Supreme Court in Romania ultimately decided, no, we're going to let this go through. It initially looked like they might have almost disqualified Lesconi as the candidate, even putting an even less popular person into the second place spot to face Georgian in the second round. But overall, the rest of the Romanian official political sphere has really not challenged Georgian very much. They're just going to kind of let this happen. Many of them, the important parties anyway, are not getting behind Elena, though there have been a lot of protests on the streets in order to say, I can't believe that we Romanians are about to elect this psychotic Nazi as president. And as an American, my heart truly goes out to you. So that's what we're looking at for this coming weekend, if this psychotic Nazi will be the president of Romania. That said, he is an independent candidate. He has no political machine behind him. He will not have the support of the Romanian parliament, and therefore will not really be able to get much of anything done. However, as still presidency, he will have power, and he will use that power to further Russian interests. And this is after Romania has been one of the more helpful of Ukraine's allies. Poland has had its back and forth. Poland is a great source of aid and political support, but there is still the farmer border blockades and such like that, which they're threatening again, by the way. The Polish farmers that we went into discussion about as basically being Russian proxies have begun to shut down the border again a bit. This is kind of a tangent. I didn't give it its own section, but this time it's over Polish trade with South America, to protest against Romanian trade with Brazil. They're going to block the Ukrainian border, make it make sense. But Poland has had its ups and downs in its relationship, even with the closeness. Hungary is Hungary. But Romania, even when there was possibly going to be these farmer boycotts, the Romanian government kind of shut it down pretty quick. So to go from that to Romania being pretty reliable to having the Duganite as their president would be a pretty considerable change, even if he would not be backed up by parliament. So looking forward to that on Sunday. But now getting into Georgia. Now, we've talked about in the past how in the Georgian elections, the ruling Georgia Dream Party had pretty blatantly did some vote rigging. Most obviously by spoiling ballots, by handing people ballots that already had the Georgia Dream candidate marked, and therefore, if someone voted for anyone else, that little dot in the Georgia Dream section meant that their ballot will be invalidated. All very obvious and blatant stuff by the ruling regime in Georgia, and I am willing to now call them a regime because of their actions since the election. Now, there had been some protests against the vote rigging, though I and many other observers were very concerned that these protests would not be enough to actually accomplish anything from the standpoint of people who like Georgia, this has been out of concern. I kind of gave a rant for it, I think, last time, where I said that allowing the illegitimate government of Georgia to stay in power, you give them time to become legitimate. And from the anti-Georgian side of things, people were doing a victory lap. See, the opposition can't even organize anyone on the streets. That just means that the people of Georgia are actually with us. That has now completely changed. The Georgia Dream government completely overstepped in the days and weeks after the election. They immediately announced that they were no longer going to continue with the process of seeking European Union membership. This could have been something they could have sandbagged on. It isn't like Georgia was going to join the European Union tomorrow anyway. They could have just been a bit lazy with it, and no one would even have noticed outside of the NGO sphere. They could have just had a passive pro-Russian stance, but that wasn't enough. Their tremendous arrogance that we have seen time and time again over the course of the last year especially, but going back further, meant that they had to say right out that they're going to go against the will of pretty much the entirety of the Georgian people. The Georgian Dream Party was a pro-European Union party. When people voted for them, it was done under the assumption that even if they're not as proactive about it as the opposition, they would be moving in the direction towards Europe that they wanted. So, of course, they had to say no. And this, of course, mirrors a lot of Euromaidan in Ukraine. So to recap on how the Revolution of Dignity happened, Yanukovych ran on a pro-European Union slate. People understood him as being, of course, the more Russia-friendly candidate. However, it still would move them towards Europe, and officially he was, until one day he decided to call off the plans for the Ukrainian-European trade agreements, which was the spark that ignited Euromaidan revolution. It, of course, became bigger because of the reaction. And again, look at Georgia. That's going to be happening now as well. But this was the same initial cause. And what makes it bigger? And what always makes these things bigger is police brutality. The Euromaidan revolution could have been contained and something for, students and politically active liberals until Yanukovych decided to stick his goons on them. And people were watching on TV as government thugs beat the absolute crap out of young people, which was something that Ukrainians could not stand by and watch, which made the revolution into the revolution, which is now what we're seeing in Georgia. There has been a very violent police crackdown. The water hoses that they're using in December, again, about the same thing as Ukraine. It was using hoses against people in December was not healthy, so that on its own is a problem, but the Georgian police are apparently also using chemical irritants in the water. So that's step one, this kind of low-grade pepper spray. But also just good old-fashioned ass beatings. The police are absolutely beating on people, including, as I'm recording this right now, the police are out stronger than they've ever been. They have tried to seal off Rustaveli Avenue, which is the main thoroughfare in Tbilisi. And I'm not checking. In fact, I'll check the news right now. I'm going to check it right now to see the status of things because you're going to get this news tomorrow, but it will be old news by the time you hear it. So yeah, I'm going to do a quick search for Tbilisi. And yeah, of course, it's bigger than any night before. The meeting seems to be gigantic and the police response is equally gigantic. The police have also specifically targeted journalists and NGO activists in the crowd. They look for them and assault them directly. And just as Ukraine had its own kind of social contract with the police that said that there could not be violent crackdowns on protests, and by breaking that social contract is what led to the revolution. In Georgia, there is a bit of a social contract that if the police do crack down on protesters, is kept to Rustaveli, again, the main thoroughfare in the capital, Tbilisi. But after someone leaves Rustaveli, they are kind of in the clear. That's no longer the case. The police are now following people home and assaulting them at their own houses. And not only police, or at least not only official police, but also somebody in police-esque uniforms without any insignia. They could be police, they could just be private thugs, and of course just normal, private, hired thugs, the Tatushki, as they were called in Ukraine, the random street toughs that are then hired out by people who needs someone beaten up, and they have their own Tatushki, as we've discussed about Georgia in the past. So as the government has severely increased its repressions, it is being met with larger and larger protests. These protests themselves have started fighting back. You're seeing a lot of video right now coming out on social media of people just straight up tackling the police, running into barricades. I saw one barricade made out of dumpsters that were strung together and pushed towards the police lines. And these protests are happening all over the country, not just in Tbilisi. They're happening in Kutaisi, which is famous as being a more conservative city. In Batumi, the city on the coast, not just the cities, in villages of just a couple thousand people, there are these large protests. This is not something that can just be turned down, and the government does not seem interested in turning down the heat, even as everywhere these protests are taking place. The prime minister has tried to explain, oh no, I didn't mean completely back away from the European Union, but no one's buying it. Nobody's buying it. So meanwhile, the president, Salome Zurabishvili, has drawn the line in the sand. She has said that parliament is illegitimate. Therefore, anyone who parliament may select to replace her as president will be illegitimate. So she is remaining as president, despite the fact that her presidency will run out soon and will be selected by the parliament. But again, illegitimate parliament. So Zurabishvili, who had been a kind of Georgia dream defector to the opposition, is now the de facto leader of the opposition and being recognized as the legitimate head of state. This is only getting bigger and bigger with each passing day. There can always be a deal. Some deal can be struck to have a redo of the election. But again, let's look at Ukraine. There was a deal in place to end the protests and kick the can down the road to new elections in a couple of months. Yanukovych decided to run away. So these deals can go in any direction also. The future is always unsure. But the present that we're looking at right now, this will not end easily. The Georgian people is rising up against a government who tried to steal their voice, and the whole of Ukraine stands with the Georgian people. There's one poem by, the very, very famous Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, that this poem, The Caucasus, became especially relevant in Ukraine after a very famous video of some soldiers tearing down Russian propaganda, and this poem was being hidden behind it. And the refrain of this poem of Taras Shevchenko reaching out to the people of the Caucasus to fight against the Russians. The portion of it that's used as the refrain goes as this. And glory mountains blue to you, in ageless ice encased, and glory freedom's knights to you, whom God will not forsake. Keep fighting, you are sure to win. God helps you in your fight. For fame and freedom march with you, and right is on your side. So Georgians, keep fighting, you're sure to win. And for a very last-minute pre-release update here, this latest night of protests has begun with a very severe crackdown by the Georgian government. Multiple members of opposition political parties have been arrested, and arrested in quite violent ways, of the police going directly to their homes, beating them up and dragging them to jail. The footage of this is quite shocking. These are very high-profile politicians, and the government has given up on any pretense of pretending like things can possibly be normal. But I'm not going to delay any further to see what else happens tonight, but it's getting worse. Our last segment here is going to take us out of Europe to Syria. Syria is typically not within Ukraine Without Hype's remit, though we have talked about it a little bit in the past. But what we're taking away from Syria right now is relevant to Ukraine, so here we go. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, has largely been in a frozen, or that's not the best way to put it, a semi-frozen state since about 2020. When the Syrian revolution began, the rebel groups, and there were many, many, many rebel groups. I'm not going to try to tease everything apart. I'll get to the two most relevant ones later, for at least the presently relevant ones. Had the Syrian government almost beaten In 2014-2015, the Syrian Arab army was practically hanging on to the ropes until Russia intervened. Now, you may notice that those years, 2014, as the years of the hot phase of the Donbass War before the Minsk Accords shifted that into a state of semi-frozenness until, of course, the full-scale invasion. And the Russians were busy in 2014 and 2015 with Ukraine, but as soon as their attention allowed them to look elsewhere, they began this very large-scale intervention in Syria to back up Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, to the point where the various rebel groups were eventually pushed back to controlling only the city of Idlib in the northwest. The Russian effort to do this feeds into their activities in Ukraine. A lot of the formations that initially formed up to fight against Ukraine back in 2014 were later used against the Syrians. I'm thinking primarily here of the Wagner Group and other PMCs. The Wagner Group, which was the most effective fighting force in the Russian military in the early stages of the full-scale invasion, until they had their little putsch that caused the Russian government to disband them and reform them to be sent off to Africa. They really forged themselves from a smaller group of ideologues fighting against Ukraine into a fully forged political military force in Syria. Though Syria is also where they faced off against America directly at one point and lost very badly. But also a lot of the Russian officers who fought against Ukraine fought against Syria. The same Russian officers who ordered the destruction of Ukrainian cities ordered the destruction of Syrian cities just a few years beforehand. And beyond that, the information sphere around the Ukraine war was built initially to service the Syrian war. All the various media figures that you're now seeing, or most of them anyway, promoting pro-Russian narratives, anti-Ukrainian conspiracy theories about, biolabs or whatever the case may be. They got their start talking about Syria. They got their start as creating conspiracy theories to deny Russian and Assadist war crimes in Syria by denying the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people. And conversely, a lot of the foreign non-Ukrainian open source intelligence people, military commentators who began commenting a lot on the Ukrainian side got their start on the Syrian civil war as well, talking about Assad's crimes before they talked about the full-scale Russian invasion. And just in the name of personal accountability, my biggest mistakes when thinking about the full-scale Russian invasion were because I was thinking about Russian behavior in Syria. At one point, I naively believed that maybe the Russians would be less horrifically violent and genocidal towards Ukrainians compared to Syrians because they thought of Syrians as being basically subhuman and Ukrainians as being basically Russian. And I and others thought that maybe that would temper their bloodlust just a little bit. And it did not. It very much did not. I also thought that Russian tactics as used in Syria would be used more in Ukraine, which mostly translated to using a lot of air power and artillery power to then be more conservative with their use of infantry. I was very much wrong about that. Artillery, yes, that's still the backbone of Russian military tactics. Air power, they've used heavily. They like bombing Ukrainian cities quite a bit. But they do not have air supremacy, and they cannot use their air power in the same way that they can in Syria. And oh boy, was I wrong about the conservative use of infantry. They are not afraid to throw lives away, when in Syria, they were more touch and go with it. But anyway, on to the news. What happened in this last week is that the rebel groups that are holding in Idlib in the north of Syria as well, and the two rebel groups, and in particular we have to look at here, are Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Syrian National Army. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a former al-Qaeda affiliate, but I'll talk about them in a second, and the SNA is basically just a proxy for the Turks, broke out of their containment in Idlib and began to advance towards Aleppo. The Battle of Aleppo, or the most recent, I should say, Battle of Aleppo lasted from 2012 to 2016. It was one of the most brutal things the modern world had seen thus far. The scale of the destruction, the human suffering, the death, we watched it unfold for all of those years before an eventual government victory. It was referred to as Syria's Stalingrad. Part of the brutality of this battle was that the rebels and the government kind of had each other surrounded, meaning that nowhere really on either the government side or rebel-held side was safe because everyone was surrounding each other. This most recent battle for Aleppo lasted about a day. A lot of commentators assumed that whatever advance that the rebels were making would not be able to take Aleppo because we all saw what happened and how difficult it was to take last time around. Nope, one day. Syrian government forces dissolved immediately on contact, ran away as soon as they could. Some of them were killed in the process, but many of them fled before they could even be killed. Apparently, some of the Russians who were stationed there with the Syrians had even been given orders to prevent the Syrians from fleeing, but by the time they received those orders, the Syrians had already fled. This was stunning. It was incredible how fast no one could have pictured this happening. If someone is saying they pictured this happening, they're lying to you to gas you up. And in the days since the capture of Aleppo, the two rebel groups I mentioned, Tahrir al-Sham and SNA, have spread out more and more over the northern parts of Syria, while the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, which Americans will sometimes erroneously refer to as the Kurds because it's kind of a Kurdish-led project, but never mind that, have also done the same thing, with their forces now trying to take the city of Deir ez-Zor, located on the Euphrates River, which the Euphrates River mostly being the border between, quote-unquote, the Kurds and the Syrian government. Though the exact militias being used by, quote, the Kurds right now are largely Arab, the Arab parts of the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. It is a kind of multi-ethnic, multi-religious movement there, not just the Kurds. And as this is going on, it seemed like the government had no response ready. The rebel groups were quickly advancing on the next city of Hama, and at first it looked like there wasn't even going to be a defense of Hama, but that quickly changed. The Syrian government has been able to kind of halt the rapid expanse of the Syrian rebels towards Hama, but not as strong looking as they used to. However, meanwhile, these two rebel groups I mentioned are starting to have some infighting. So, like I said, the Syrian National Army is mostly a proxy of the Turkish government, and the Turkish government mostly just wants to kill Kurds and treats Bashar al-Assad as a secondary problem that they are more or less okay with. So the SNA has begun assaulting Kurdish areas, though Tahrir al-Sham is trying to stop that and was able to negotiate a withdrawal of Kurdish militias out of the Aleppo territory into larger Kurdish-held territory. There's a lot going on. Trying to describe the Syrian civil war is never easy, and even the situation within these last week, that itself is already kind of hard to condense. But as we're seeing right now, the state of play is that Tahrir al-Sham, despite its very hardline Islamist history and some of the personal brutality of its leader Jolani, some of the propaganda about them being legitimate state builders appears to, though so far, be true. Aleppo seems to have better services now than it did under Syrian government control. Jolani has made numerous declarations that all ethnic groups and religious groups were under his protection and are seen as integral parts of the Syrian people. And this quasi-state that had been built in Idlib for these last few years, people have been commenting on it as being seemingly pretty competent. We're seeing that now with Aleppo and the other territories they've taken over. They seem to be, between the SNA and the Syrian government, kind of the softer hand, which was always the fear. Even though, just to be absolutely clear, even with some of the questionable backgrounds of these rebel groups, that's putting it lightly, the Syrian government has always been far worse. If you're looking at a count of who has killed who, the Syrian government and their Russian supporters way, 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 way more than killing anybody than any other faction has been killing people. Death and destruction of the Syrian government makes them by far the worst evil. That said, the rule of Tahrir al-Sham in these areas will be tested in the future, but so far so good, I guess. Though the SNA, different story, they want to kill Kurds. So why is this all relevant besides, the big preamble I gave about interconnectivity between Syria and Ukraine is for the future, this really shows the weakness of Russia. As I described, the Syrian government was on its back heels until the Russians came and saved them. The Russians and the Iranians, especially Hezbollah, as a proxy for Iran. Where is Russia now? Tied up in Ukraine. Where is the Wagner Group? One of the most important pro-Russian factions in the Syrian civil war. They broke against the Rock of Bakhmut, though they eventually took the city. They were destroyed in the process. Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, is dead, killed by Putin for trying to have a little bit of a revolt. Whereas Hezbollah, that's now destroyed in the Israel-Lebanon war. Iran's capabilities are also severely degraded. There is talk of Shia militia being rushed in from Iraq to bolster the Syrian government, but so far their attempts to enter Syria have been harassed, including by the U.S., and Assad is more isolated than he's almost ever been, or at least since those early days of the revolution. Russia is not all-powerful. They can't do everything at once. Russia's ability to hold its empire together has been severely degraded by the Russo-Ukraine war. We talked about Armenia, how Armenia is leaving the Russian sphere of influence because that sphere of influence failed them, and Russia is very limited in its ability to enforce it. Central Asia has been kind of puffing out its chest towards Russia a lot more recently. Russia's not invincible. If you stand up to them enough, they can be beaten. America and the West have the economic might, has the political authority, has the military capabilities, the military production capabilities, that if they take Russia as the serious threat that it must be taken as, they can be beaten. They are stretched to the very limits of their abilities right now. If there is appropriate vision and follow through, they can be taken down. And with the overextension that they're going through right now, if they're taken down right now, everything else collapses with it. All it takes is the willpower to do it. And unfortunately, the West does not have that willpower. I don't think Trump does. Biden did not. In Europe, we're seeing backsliding and threats of even pro-Russian forces in many of these countries coming to power. Romania, for instance. This is a very solvable problem if the appropriate attentions and resources are dedicated to solving it. Russia cannot maintain its empire in Syria, as we are seeing right now. Will this rebel advance continue? Who knows? They have met resistance in Hama. They may not be able to take it further, or they will. Who knows? We'll see. But the response from Russia has been very muted. Their initial response to the Syrians asking for aid was to tell them that it's basically their problem. And if you can't take care of it yourselves, then we can't save you. Which is not what they were telling the Syrians before. Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad is in Moscow right now trying to plead his case. And so far, he's not succeeding. Now, everything can, of course, change. The main Russian positions in Syria are on the Mediterranean coast in the city of Tartus and Latakia. And those two places are not under threat. If they are under threat, Russia might see the necessity to devote more resources. But so far, there have been a lot of Russian positions overtaken, a lot of Russian equipment captured, and now on the side of the rebels. And that was not enough to make Russia jump in. So yes, Russia is at its very limit. Syria is the key part of their empire building project outside of Ukraine. And they can't even do that right now. Push them now, they won't be able to take it. But I'm pessimistic. So with that, of course, like I said, Ukraine is in a very difficult position right now, militarily, and all the support is needed. So please go to our link tree to see some causes that need your help. If you would like to support this podcast, tell your friends and family about us. Make their information silo, Ukraine without hype. If you'd like to support us financially, please go to patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and join our list of supporters. I know we have not been super productive lately now that I'm in Ukraine and not horrifically sick anymore. I'm going to turn that around. But thank you all very much to our supporters who've kept us going. So thank you to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Vana Kratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jane Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan Zajkowicz, Michael Wickman, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel Lenz, Ada McDonald, Alex Rochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Munoz, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jay Cohen, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Laurie Halila, Lemonican, Liv Grove, Marianne Abbs, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Gengris, Scott Tokaryuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica Poop Sign, Who Else Dreads the Next 25 Years, Me and You, William Lewis Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus Nashkis. So thank you all very much for your support, and until next episode, Slava Ukraini, and Sakartvelo Gamarjos.